Ürün yönetimi eğitimlerimize Üretim Bandı adıyla başladık ve şimdi Brick Institute markası altına devam ediyor. Brick Institute'da sektörün lider şirketlerinden katılımcılar ve deneyimli eğitmenlerle birlikte uygulamalı, dünya standartlarında eğitimler sunuyoruz. Bugüne kadar yüzlerce arkadaşımız bu eğitimlere katıldı. Amacımız gerçek vaka çalışmalarından oluşan, sadece teoride kalmayan, elleri kirleterek öğreten eğitimler düzenleyerek sektöre dünya standartında ürün geliştirenler yetiştirmek. Haydi birbirimizden öğrenelim ve topluma fayda sağlayacak teknolojik ürünler geliştirelim. Kayıt aldığımız eğitim programlarımızı görmek için www.brick.institute linkini ziyaret edebilir ya da selam@brick.institute adresinden bizimle iletişime geçebilirsin. Selam Üretim Bandı dinleyicisi. Üretim Bandı aslında bir podcast'ten daha fazlası. Biz aktif bir topluluğuz. Ürün geliştirme ve şirket yönetimi ile alakalı konularda kendi aramızda konuştuğumuz ve yeni şeyler öğrendiğimiz aktif bir Slack platformumuz var. Katılmak istersen üretimbandı.com/slack linkine giderek topluluğumuza giriş yapabilir, sadece topluluğa özel oluşturduğumuz içerik ve etkinliklerden faydalanabilirsin. Unutmadan, topluluk üyeleriyle paylaştığımız 2 haftada bir yayınladığımız bültenimize de bekleriz. üretimbandı.com/bülten linkinden bültene kaydolabilirsin. Keyifli öğrenmeler. Hello everyone, welcome back to Üretim Bandı. This week's guest is Nacho Bassino. He is the founder and coach at Product Direction. Also host of the podcast 100 Product Strategies. Also the author of Product Direction, which whom we met last year in May in London. It's good to see you, Nacho.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Nice to see you as well.
Thanks for coming in. So we have a very big topic today, also related to your company, the name of your company, also the name of the book, Product Strategy. So you spent hundreds of hours, probably maybe even thousands of hours on this topic, both as a builder and as an author and as a coach, consultant. So this is an interesting topic. And I want to start with a question of why this topic? Because this is a very tough topic to tackle, both in terms of like doing actual product work, like in a company, but I think it's even harder to put that into like words in terms of how to do product strategy, like put it into an actionable framework. So why did you do that to yourself and pick this topic as a book topic? Yeah.
Exactly for that reason. I mean, maybe to put it in more context, I felt that I didn't have a way to explain what or how to do product strategy. So whenever someone was asking me, I felt that I was kind of giving the typical recommendations or giving a book like good strategy, bad strategy. But when we actually get to the actionable part of how to define a product strategy, what it looks like at the end and what should be in there, I felt that I have nothing to kind of really point people in which direction to point them to. So I felt that in the terms of all the product knowledge that is out there, we have this gap about how to, we have these strategy frameworks or strategy ideas or topics, like I was saying, coming from the business books, but how to actually put it into an actionable product strategy was a huge gap. And as you said, kind of getting into a real framework is super difficult. So the way I will always phrase it is, it's not a framework like an fill in the blanks template or exercise. It's more like, these are the steps that are involved in building a product strategy. And this is the frameworks or tools that you can use in each step to get to that point. So it's more like a guide and an idea on how to walk through it more than kind of ABC recipe.
Again, it's very difficult to maybe like unify the process, but you've in the book, you've given, like you said, the steps of how to get there, and each step you provide several ways of doing it, several methods that you can do. When you began this process of writing this book, did you have that framework or did you have those steps in mind?
I would say that was more of you mentioned before, it was probably many hours spent trying to identify the right steps. So it was a combination of my previous knowledge of, as I said, kind of more than 15 years doing this in practice, and then interviewing a bunch of other people, asking them, okay, how do you do it? And trying to find the patterns in this way. And just to make it completely transparent, now in my podcast, 100 Product Strategies, when I'm interviewing product leaders about how they do product strategy, I also find this pattern repeating and repeating. So it's not something that is super crazy at the end. Of course, I put in my names and I put some options as well to how to develop them. But the steps are out there already. It's not my invention. It's something that is a pattern that I see product leaders doing. I just put it kind of some name and order to it.
So from your angle, what's the difference between company strategy and product strategy? Because strategy is something where is a word that you can take anywhere you want. And product, we're product people, so we target, the product strategy, but there's more than that. There's a company strategy before. So I'm curious, from your side of things, what do they look like? What's the difference between them?
Yeah, so to put it simply, I believe that in some contexts, they are the same. So, for example, if you're a software as a service, small startup, then probably your company strategy is the same as your product strategy, and especially if you are kind of product-led and these sort of things. When it becomes more relevant is when the company becomes bigger and when the product is part of the thing. So, for example, I worked for many years in the travel industry, in which you do a bunch of things. So for sure, the product is super important, but you also have your supply side, you have your marketing side, and all those things that are super important. And then you have a company strategy that informs all the strategies of these very important departments, which product is only one of them. So for example, just to give a very obvious example, if the company strategy is to expand into a new region, for sure the product team will have a lot of things to do in order to make the product accessible and understandable by people in that region. But also the supply team should be able to kind of make the contacts with all the suppliers in that region. And the marketing team should be able to approach people or have the marketing funnel for people in that region. So the company strategy informs each strategy of each department. That would be more kind of the deep dive of each department in their own strategy.
That makes sense because I used to do SaaS before, and then before that I used to do e-commerce. And in e-commerce, I used to always say the product that you're selling, the actual physical product that you're selling, is a bit more important than the platform or the web or the mobile app that you're building. Obviously, the apps are also important, but if you don't have a good physical product, whatever you're selling at the good price, then you can have the best conversion rate as possible, but you still won't be able to sell things. But in SaaS, the product itself is the digital product, let's say the software product, is much more important. So it makes sense that the company strategy and the product strategy is more aligned in the SaaS world than it is in like marketplace or e-commerce and stuff. So in this book, your book Product Direction, when you were writing it, who did you have in mind? Like, who was your target market? We're product people. So who was your target market? Was it like the senior product leaders? Was it, individual contributor product managers, non-product people? Who were they?
Yeah, no, I actually have I think a small elevator pitch in the first few pages, and it's targeted particularly to product leaders. I will say that product leaders, I took it with a bit of a broader term, sort of, because, in product leader, you can count for any level of leadership between the product change. So this is kind of a good way to see it. And also senior PMs who sometimes have responsibility over strategy. I feel those are the ones who benefit from having a framework, and usually something that helps them grow into more senior leadership roles by being strong at strategy. And the other thing I would say is that, going back to what I was saying about the size of the company, I will say that most of these methods are when you reach particular scale. So this scale is usually when you are a, say, scale-up startup. So when you have 4 or 5 product teams and beyond, because when you are so small, then the alignment and the clarity of what we are doing is in kind of everyone's head. It's not very useful to add a lot of process to it. Yeah,
so focusing on that, I want to hear more about that actually, because you're right in the sense that when the company gets bigger, when the problem, the challenge that you're tackling gets bigger, the alignment need or the clarification need is bigger. But when you're a smaller team, I guess when you're around the same table, the communication is easier. But however, on that front, the problem might be bigger in the sense that it's not clear. Like how to solve the problem might not be clear. Even the problem that you're solving might not be clear. So in that, when you're tackling the quote unquote strategy problem at that level, how do you suggest people go about it?
Yeah, so maybe to split it or to try to clarify what the strategy is in a very kind of short sentence is, hey, we are trying to align which are the right problems to solve. So if you are thinking in the context of a startup, as you were saying, probably is one particular problem, and it's not so much of a strategy selection problem. It's more of, validation of this is the right problem sort of thing. So in that scenario, what I would say is that strategy at the end of the day is one big bet on the direction you want to go. And you need to validate as early as possible if that direction is correct. So as you were saying, in a small startup, I will not say, hey, let's make a huge opportunity tree and see all the things out there. We probably know from kind of getting our first customers which are the problems that we need to focus on. And then let's do a whole ton of validation to see if we are solving the problem the right way. So I will frame more as a discovery problem than a strategy problem at that stage, especially if we're talking about pre-market fit.
Okay, so where do you think is the breaking point?
As I was saying, I think that these 4 teams is my magical number. But if you think about, let's use a typical example, the marketplace with B2C and B2B, if you have only 2 teams focusing in these 2 markets, you already need to have some alignment on what you are doing in both sides, because at the end of the day, what you do on one side which will influence the other one. But this is probably not big enough to have kind of a strong artifacts or ceremonies to align. When you reach these 4 teams point, you will have multiple opportunities you can tackle because you have more capacity to tackle more problems. And all these teams will probably be already doing some discovery or some kind of investigation on the directions they want to go, and they will have multiple opportunities. So at this stage is when it becomes a bit more important to say, okay, this is the differentiation we want to make. This is the focus we want to have, is where you having this visibility of opportunities, having a clear selection and a communication of that strategy becomes more relevant. And for sure, when you grow, kind of it only becomes harder.
So while you were explaining the 4 teams, I was trying to go back in time and think about my experiences. And I'm thinking, I think we had problems or challenges around like product strategy even before we had like 4 teams. I think one of the key challenges were, so we were, as with all teams, and one of the methods that you point out is OKRs, obviously. And the beauty of OKRs is that you work in quarters, so 3 months at a time. And we were trying to basically clarify the strategy for each OKR. And that's when we had the issue of, okay, so 3 months is a very short amount of time for a strategy. It's a good amount of time to do for a roadmap, let's say, to build something and get some feedback and then reiterate on it. But in terms of like getting one clear strategy, it's a bit short amount of time. So in your mind, when we talk about strategy, product strategy, what time zone or not what time period are we talking about?
Yeah, I usually talk about between 12 and 18, 24 months. But this is highly dependent. And the dependency is, maybe going back to what you were saying, is in the stability of the product and the kind of the company that you are working in. So for example, if you are working in a large company that the goals that you are setting is, hey, let's grow 10%, then the strategy can be kind of more focused, not that big of a bet, and can have more stability. If you are working in for example, as was maybe the example you were saying, a pre-market fit startup, then I wouldn't recommend having a strategy, because you are focusing, as you said, on changing the problem as soon as you realize you need to change it. And then having all this bureaucracy of a strategy is just a pain in the ass. So it's sorry, I'm not sure if I can swear here, but so it's a kind of adding bureaucracy that's meaningless at the point.
Okay, so this is a good reminder, because product strategy is also a cop-out answer when things aren't going well. It's like, oh, we don't have a strategy, that's why. But like you said, it's at the beginning of the company's lifetime, let's say, maybe the strategy is trying to find, well, for lack of a better explanation, product market fit, let's say, in order to find the best problem to work on, and then in order to find the best solution to fix that problem. So let's just say to the people who are listening, take it with a grain of salt when it comes to strategy.
And there's an even more interesting caveat, which is, let's say, a large company spawning a new product. So at the beginning of times, you have this, hopefully, if you are doing it in a somewhat proper way, you will have a small team that is focusing on trying to discover this product and then build a strategy. If you do a kind of an upfront, super grandiose vision without any discovery done, it will probably be something that the team will need to pivot afterwards. And the bigger you do this pre-planning, because you are a big company and you want to kind of sign the budget and whatnot, the more constraints you will put in the team that is trying to discover the right product. So you need to have some initial level of product maturity to be able to build this sort of strategy.
And I think one element of the strategy part that's challenging is that it's a very soft topic. It's very high level. So, and one of the difficulties is taking that into the lower level lines of like roadmap and, OKRs and even like sprint planning if you're working with sprints. So, and I think that's why, like, even on the title of your book, you say how to build successful products at scale with strategy, roadmaps, and OKRs. And you build that, you bring it down to that level. So talk to me about that, like, transfer from high level of strategy to the OKRs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of the big areas, and usually one of the interesting symptoms of a company not having a solid strategy is when they are changing OKRs each quarter, which means you have aligned the bigger topics beforehand. But just to summarize it, when you are building the strategy, you are trying to come up with these focus areas that I usually call drivers. So it's a strategic drivers, which is these big blocks that you want to bet on and you believe can have a distinctive impact in your users and your company. Then when you go to the strategic roadmap, and there's a bit of a distinction here because roadmaps can mean anything to anyone, but what I'm talking about is strategic roadmap, which is an outcome-oriented roadmap that tries to break down this big strategic driver into smaller areas that you want to pursue. And these areas, you want to put them in a sequential order, or not areas, but opportunities. You want to put them in a sequential order that is logical, and you have an explanation of why we are doing this and then doing that. So this is the strategic roadmap. And this is a very clear way to get into the quarterly OKRs, because when you have your opportunities that are kind of sequenced over time, you can say, okay, in this quarter, we are trying to tackle these opportunities, which will have this level of impact. So your OKR is mostly, I call it an exercise in translation. So you translate your roadmaps in the specific goals that you will, or the key results that you will get in this particular quarter. And then when you go to the impact planning, or so the sprint planning, you will have this connection between, okay, I'm trying to achieve even the roadmap, this high level opportunity, and it's a problem of doing discovery and say, hey, this opportunity, how we can decompose it in solutions that we can tackle over time. So it's also connected to that.
So the roadmaps have opportunities on them, not the solutions.
Opportunity is also a big word. So it's maybe to put it a bit more concretely, is some problem you are trying to solve, some tendency you are trying to tackle, or some customer problem that you identify and you can fix. So this is the sort of level of abstraction we are aiming for, which is, as I was saying, lower than a strategic driver. That can be something bigger, like, let's say, expanding to a new country.
Okay, so the drivers are the high level, let's say, pillars that we want to take the company towards. They're less clear, or not say less clear, but it's less granular. Roadmaps are a bit more granular. It tackles, let's say, the problem areas. And then the OKRs, again, OKRs ideally don't have any like solutions on them, right? It's more like, in your mind, goals and outcomes that you want to achieve.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal. And so saying, maybe just to clarify it one more time, is like, it's an exercise of breaking down things. So when you have your strategy, you say the drivers are kind of very big and massive things, but still opportunities. Then when you go to the roadmap, are a bit more breaking down. And when you go back to what the teams will work on, for example, if you work, I suggest working in the book, I suggest working with opportunity solution trees. And this is a very good way to say, okay, my big level opportunity, I will break it down in smaller level opportunities, and they will break it down in potential solutions and experiments. So it's always a problem of refining these big topics into the things that we can concretely do to achieve them.
So one question that I can imagine people are asking right now when they're listening to it is, and I'm sure you've come across this problem because you've worked with a lot of companies, both as a coach and as a full-time employee yourself. That's the ideal place that we want to go to. Like, that's the best outcome that we can have. Realistically, usually we're not 100% there. Sometimes we're 10% there, and sometimes we're at 80% there. What would you suggest to people? Because in reality, we might not be close to ideal, but we want to get there. And let's assume that they have some sort of friction coming from either the leadership or their teammates or whatever. Like, how do they tackle that reality, let's say?
Yeah, I usually tell that the best approach is reverse engineering. So it's basically, let's say you are kind of filling in feature factory and the stakeholders are discussing features. And this is not something I will say, hey, no, let's not discuss features and let's discuss tomorrow's strategic drivers and we will not talk about features anymore. So the right way to do it is kind of, if you think about, there's another model that's very interesting and I think resembles some of the topics in my book, which is called the decision stack by Martin Eriksson. And in this stack, you say, hey, the strategy should explain why we are doing these objectives, and the initiative should explain why or how we are planning to achieve this objective. So if you go through this line of thinking, you get to the feature itself, and you start asking why to go to the upper stages. So I'm realizing I'm doing a lot of hands movements, so I'll try to be more audio driven. So basically, if you are asking yourself why I'm doing this feature, is because probably you are trying to achieve an outcome. And if you ask why you are trying to achieve this outcome, it's probably because you are trying to hit a particular strategy that involves a differentiation or a position in the market you want to have. So in this way, you can track your steps back. And the interesting part, so that's the first step, and it's the most logical and obvious one. But at the end of the day, it's just to that, you will tell, hey, Nacho, yes, I put a nice wrapper to my feature factory, and it's just still a feature factory. So the interesting part is the second step, in which you do two things. The first one is, okay, now that I clarify what's my opportunity, what's my strategy, let's identify other solutions, other features that can potentially fit this strategy. And this is, again, something where the opportunity solution tree can help you, because you are discussing one particular feature. When you go up to the opportunity level, you will be able to say, okay, for this opportunity, not only this feature is the thing I can do these other three things. And then you can also work with some scoring methods. So there's the I scoring or RISE scoring or whatever. I mean, I don't want to put a presentation label here, but you can actually start debating based on the outcome we are trying to achieve. These are the potential of the different solutions that we can tackle. And this is what enables you to have conversations that are more outcome-driven with your stakeholders. And this is what starts kind of changing the game and giving you more leadway to do some experimentation. Because at the end of the day, you can say, hey, for these opportunities, we have very low confidence. So let's do some discovery to gain more confidence and to really understand which is the best path to tackle. No stakeholder on earth wants to just be focus on features that will not deliver any impact. So when you change the game and you make this clear, you're making your thought process clear so they can walk with you and enable you to kind of have more fruitful discussions.
That's a great suggestion because, like you said, if you start with, no, we're not going to be a feature factory, that's immediately an environment for a discussion or at its best term, more like an argument. Because then it turns into like, it's you're not really comparing apples to apples. That's a different area. But when you say, okay, start with a feature, it's fine to start with a feature and then just talk about, okay, why do you want to build this feature? What's the outcome? What's the purpose? What's the goal? And then you say in the second stage, okay, how else can we solve this problem or the outcome that we want to achieve? Then you get the entire party into the discussion. It's very applicable suggestion. Perfect.
And there is another interesting consequence of this exercise is many teams are kind of tackling different features that are kind of all over the place. So when you say we are not being strategic, it's probably because you are doing something for, let's say, something for operations, something for sales, something to kind of improve the onboarding and whatnot. And it's very difficult to say, okay, is this onboarding feature more important than my operations feature? Very hard to measure. When you go one step up and when you say, hey, these are two different outcomes. Do we want to reduce operation cost or do we want to improve retention of new users? And that's a much more clear conversation to have with your stakeholders. So again, when you're discussing features, hey, saying this feature is more important than the other one, very difficult. When you're discussing outcomes, it's much easier for stakeholders to make an informed decision. So again, you're facilitating, let's say, these better conversations in a way.
So one key element that you mentioned were the drivers, this concept of drivers, which is an interesting word. I like that word because it basically has, like, when I think about drivers, I think about like basically a machine, and you have levers that you can play with those drivers. But on the other hand, in order to figure out what those drivers are in your market, you need to have maybe even like you need to have a lot of experience in that market. So I'm curious what you think about that, because if you're experienced in that market, you know the players, you know the customers, you know how the customers are making their decisions, you have a more experienced instinct, let's say gut feeling. But how would you suggest, let's say, individual contributor level product managers tackle that problem of like trying to identify those drivers?
Interesting. So maybe one thing we should clarify is that strategy is, as I was saying before, this exercise of selecting the most important challenges that we need to solve. And in that sense, the work is more for the leaders. So I will expect the leaders to be more on the lead on this topic. On the other hand, what's interesting is that there are maybe two afterthoughts is that individual contributors should be helping the leaders identify these kind of big problems. So in a way you were saying, I expect the leaders to be kind of knowledgeable about the market environment. But for example, understanding, hey, our competitors are having these trends or are implementing this type of solutions and things like that. So kind of benchmarking world, the individual contributor can be a big player. And for sure, the second big player is kind of getting in touch with the user. I hope that the leaders will have some sense of what the user is needing, but the ones who are probably day in, day out having interviews or having some sort of discovery exposure are the individual contributors. So I would recommend that they have this interaction with the leaders. And to make it more concretely, what very good or healthy relationship will be between individual contributor and leader is discussing this opportunity solution tree. So getting back to it, and just I will say one more word, it doesn't necessarily need to be a tree. It's kind of discussing opportunities in general. So use whatever tool you want, but it's kind of being able to say, okay, in this area, we have these opportunities and we believe that these are more impactful than these other ones because we have this evidence. And this is a work that the individual contributor should help the leader visualize, so the leader can make this strategic decision saying, we will focus on this area instead of this other one because we have these high-level opportunities. So this is the way I suggest a healthy involvement, especially kind of in big organizations.
Okay. And have you done this challenge or have you done this, workshop, let's say, with company leaders, so non-product leaders?
What do you mean?
Just general, like I don't have specifically like opportunity solution tree in my mind, but in terms of like trying to figure out the market drivers and trying to discussing between yourselves what the opportunities are and how to focus on them. Like, does the product leader need to do this alone or with the other leaders in the company as well?
Yeah, no. Usually it's more kind of say even interdisciplinary exercise. So when you are selecting a strategic driver, this is something that will hopefully be something aligned with the other areas because it will have an impact in other areas. So let's say, for example, that we are going for, I want to put a particular kind of idea in mind, but let's say that we are trying to impact the operational efficiency. So we're trying to reduce the cost of operations. And that's the kind of the goal we're trying to achieve. And maybe our strategic driver is be able to automate more of our customer support. So how you as a product leader work on the strategic driver or selecting the strategic driver is something that you need to align with your operations counterparts. So probably they are the ones kind of picking up the phone. So they will probably have not only kind of more knowledge about what customer problems you need to solve, but also how all these processes, internal processes work. So it's important to be aligned with them. And on the other hand, probably the marketing people should be on the table as well, or the marketing kind of lead should be on the table as well, because they should know that they will receive less attention. So and this is where kind of having the CEO or some kind of higher level stakeholder in place is important, because we are making at the end of the day these trade-off decisions that will affect some areas in different ways.
Okay, so in terms of this concept of drivers, it also reminds me of this quote that Keith Rabois, which is like an investor, an operator. He was like founding team at Square or something, like this big Silicon Valley personality, let's say. And he has this concept of he says that each business has an underlying equation. It's basically like a math equation underneath it. That's what the concept of drivers made me think when I was reading your book. So there are drivers in your company's equation, let's say, and you're trying to move those drivers up and down. So, equation suggests that it's very deterministic, or rather it's very well defined. But in your writings, it's more it has some sort of experimentation or trying to clarify the unknown sense. So what do you think about that duality, let's say?
First of all, I absolutely agree with this underlying model. Maybe equation is too hard, but I usually start my, going back to the exploration exercise that you were mentioning, I usually start by trying to kind of define this model. I call it the kind of a product model. So it's how your user behaves with the product and what are the things that happen in between that have these levers. So for example, the e-commerce example is very easy because you have probably a funnel, and that's the kind of the model of your product. If we are going for a software as a service, probably it's a bit different because you have some sort of onboarding or early usage stage. Then you become a more recurrent user and you have these loops that you will do. And this is the model of your product. So you're trying to define for your product in particular which is kind of the high level view. Why is that important? Because going back to what I was saying, that I'm not super in love with opportunity trees, it's because it's much easier to think about this model of your product into particular parts for which you will have opportunities. So we'll say, going back to let's say use someone as a service example, if you have some sort of early onboarding, this early onboarding can spawn a set of opportunities. And opportunities can be can come from two different sources. First one is what the users are telling you, what's difficult for them, the problems they have, what may make their lives happier. And then you have the company side, in which you're saying, hey, I know the operations teams is having a lot of effort in one particular area, or there's something you can automate, or things like that will kind of impact your business in a positive way. So in a way, this model enables the exploration. So going back to your question, because I went all over the place, but you have this model that you should visualize, you should map, and if you don't have it, I encourage all your listeners that start by building this sort of model of your product. Should be super easy. And again, there are many, if your product is not super complex, there is for sure a blueprint out there. But then from this one, you can start exploring which opportunities you have in the different areas. And then when coming to the drivers, as you were saying, probably it's easy to say, hey, in this area, we have more problems, we can make a better differentiation or whatnot. And this is the one that will spawn this sort of thinking of opportunities that you can translate afterwards to a roadmap and OKRs and all the things we mentioned before.
So I think this is one thing that you also mentioned in the book, which is this product strategy is also a very strong communication tool. And yes, in the OKR level of things, you have maybe like numeric metrics, like numbers, but on the high level or the strategy, you have more like a story, basically. So how would you suggest to improve that story? Because you can't just say like, okay, strategy 1, 2, 3, these are the bullet points. I mean, I guess you can say like our strategy is 1, 2, 3, but it kind of needs to have some sort of a story at the back so that people can remember like day to day. It's like very difficult to go like, okay, what were the 3 points? Rather, it's easier to remember like if it's a story that we can, visualize.
Yes, good point. So maybe going back to this later stage of strategy in which you are trying to communicate, I usually say that you need two things. So in one hand, the summary chart. So this is the one pager, the one who has the bullets, kind of the one line with the goal that you are trying to achieve. I usually suggest that to include in there a small explanation of why this is important, but this is kind of the kind of high level artifact. And then you will need your pitch that usually, for sure you will do the 1 hour presentation with a long slide deck and whatnot. So this is kind of the one timer you will have. But then strategy needs to live in the minds of people to make everyday decisions. So that's the key goal of strategy, that we can actually execute on it. So you will need to have a story that you can tell in, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes to begin kind of all major important questions or meetings like OKR definition, OKR alignment. So you will be able to have these few minutes of pitching, hey, we are doing these OKRs because this is our strategy. So I think I'm 100% agreeing on what you're saying. You need these building blocks to be able to tell it. But this should be a narrative version of your summary. So at the end of the day, you are trying to explain the same things. So one is a one charter that people can have, in presentations or printed in the walls if they are still going to the office. And the other one is the version that you can kind of tell people so we can make it a bit more tangible.
Okay. And just a cheeky question, but which one is better, having a bad strategy or not having a strategy at all?
Not tricky at all. I will 100% go for bad strategy. And the reason is that if you have a bad strategy, means that first you are thinking about the strategy, which is already good. And the second one is that you can validate, or in this case, probably invalidate it and pivot afterwards. So, and maybe this is a good, another way to frame it is, people is usually scared of kind of doing the strategy process because they will say, hey, if I select a strategy that is bad, I will kind of be blamed or execute in a bad direction. But actually, it's the opposite. I usually say, start with what you have, because there is some opportunities out there. You are doing something anyway, so let's try to put that into a strategy, even when we know it's bad, because then we can say, hey, we are pursuing this driver. Is this driver right or not? Is something that we can do discovery on. If you are not declaring it at all, then people are just executing for the sake of execution, and you are not having this chance of really saying, okay, my strategy was bad and I can actually change it.
I feel like one assumption that we have is that, and what you're repeating is, I think, adding to that, is that you're looking at things that are more like hypothesis. Like, we don't know the reality. We have to check. I mean, we have maybe instincts and we have, signals coming from the market, and we have our opinions, and that's stemming from our experience. But at the end of the day, these are all experiments. Even the strategy itself is an experiment, right?
Yes. Yeah, actually, going through, I didn't mention the 4 steps in the book, but I actually start with the insights, then selection, and the 3rd step is goals and hypotheses. So I make it very explicit that you need to say, hey, I'm trying to achieve this, so grow in this market or reduce operational costs or whatever, because I have this hypothesis, and this is kind of tied to your driver. So it's like, hey, I believe that by actioning this driver, I can have this goal, but this is hypothesis. And when you have this strategic hypothesis, then maybe going back to what I said, is everything about breaking down things. The teams will be able to break down this big level hypothesis into smaller level hypotheses that they can do some validation around. So yeah, it's absolutely an hypothesis.
So you mentioned the steps. Which step do you think is the most challenging part?
Select, the second one. But what I call the second one, of course, maybe there are some other implementations, but when you are seeing all these insights, then you need to focus on the few key ones that will really make a difference. And the important part is that this is not kind of the typical prioritization, rise or rise scoring or ROI exercise. It's more about, okay, what positioning and differentiation I want to have in the market. What do I want the users or the customers to select me for? What's a strategic advantage I can create and sustain over time? These are very, very hard questions. And there are kind of, there are a few frameworks that you can use. But at the end of the day, is kind of making this big strategic bet happens, particularly in this step in which you are saying yes to something and no to everything else, which is also kind of tricky. Because if you are selecting something too high level, can feel that you are saying yes to anything. So it's important that you select something very specific that you are committing to do.
It's also, I think, challenging because the feedback period, the feedback time is also a bit longer in strategy. I mean, I guess the point would be then, okay, let's make it shorter then. Like, let's make experiments that we can, validate these strategies. But again, strategy, it's a big play. And you mentioned the 3 horizon strategy. If you're, for example, working on something on the 3rd horizon, which is like the big bet, the feedbacks that you're going to get, or the real feedback that you're going to get from the market, is going to take some time. So I guess it's difficult, but we should, perhaps shorten those feedback loops.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this goes back to everything we discussed, because you have this high-level hypothesis, but it's all about breaking down these big problems into smaller problems or smaller things that you will act on. So when you came from a strategy driver, you break it down into opportunities around your roadmap, you kind of put them into quarterly OKRs, you start executing on the sprints. If you are not making a difference in your OKRs, you already have a signal that your strategy is incorrect. So compare this to another company which doesn't have any connection from strategy to OKRs. They wouldn't know until 12 months pass that the strategy is incorrect. So you want to have this early validation and this connection from what the teams are doing to your strategy, because the signals will happen sprint by sprint. And yes, for sure, as you were saying, the early signals will have a bit of uncertainty, but will be minor signals, and signals will become stronger as you move along. But you will have already these early signals. So it's important to have this connection between the different steps. And one extra thing that probably we didn't cover is that strategy, you asked me early on what's the time frame for the strategy. I said 12 months and 24 months. But actually, in reality, you are having this strategy evolving constantly. So I usually recommend having quarterly strategy reviews. But if you go to a more tangible way of doing things, for example, for this hypothesis, you will start executing, you will get some validation, either good or bad. And the most likely scenario is that your strategy will remain the same, but you will add more information to it. You will add more flavor to it. You will be more specific in certain areas. So this is the work that helps having the strategy connected to the execution of the teams, because they will reinforce each other constantly.
Nacho, I congratulate you and I applaud you for having the courage to tackle this huge topic of product strategy. I think it was very difficult to put that into an applicable framework. And I think you have a pretty great one. So I highly recommend people read your book. And I'll put that in the links in the description, because it's a pretty good step-by-step approach, and in each step you have several playbooks or frameworks that you can use. So I commend you for it, and thank you so much for coming in and explaining or sharing your knowledge and experience on product strategy.
No, thanks for having me. I think your questions were spot on, so always glad to have these sort of interactions.
Perfect, thank you. And also listen to Nacho's podcast. It's in English. It's 100 product strategies, and he only talks about product strategy.
It's good because he's interviewing product leaders about the real life challenges. So if someone wants more concrete examples, there are also some examples out there.
Perfect. Any recommendations on which episode to start with?
I really like episode 6, for example, which is a very concrete example of a software as a service. So if you are in this sort of realm, it's a very interesting one.
Okay, perfect. Start with episode 6. Thank you again, Nacho, and thank you everyone for listening, and hope to see you in the next episode.